Welcome to the Story Partners Podcast. I'm Annie Manus, and we're so glad you found us. Jason and Katherine both had a strong desire to encounter God, but they didn't know where to find him. In unique ways, God was pursuing each of their hearts and preparing them for what lay ahead.
I felt very alone. I had nobody. And, okay, this is going to sound crazy, but I'm just going to put it out there. I just felt this presence in the room. And I had my head down, and I could see the room getting brighter, like someone was turning on a light. And I couldn't look up. And I remember just feeling this peace and this calmness and this certainty, knowing that God was real. And I didn't know that God was Jesus necessarily, right? But I knew without a doubt, probably for the first time in my life, that there were no questions as to whether God was real.
We should stop here and share that this is an unusual episode because it's actually a two-part story. This week is part one, where you'll hear Jason and Katherine's backstory and kind of get to know their personalities and their interesting backgrounds. And then next week, we'll be releasing part two, where you'll hear the rest of their story. Listening to this episode will give you a basis for understanding what will happen in part two of the story. This is season 2, episode 10, part 1, When Church Hurts.
My dad was a miner, like a gold miner, and my mom was pretty much a housewife. So we lived on mining claims 25 miles out in the middle of nowhere. I was kind of a wild child. I spent most of my time outside. I was very curious, and I questioned everything.
I kind of did not have the popular kid route. I was more of the loner, loser kid route, if you will. The one that, had to fight and claw for really anything. I had a hard time making friends. Even in junior high school, before we moved to Texas from Vegas, I just felt like an outcast. I always felt very alone, like nobody really liked me. I felt like I had to go earn my friends. I think because of my level of insecurity, I was very attracted to strong leaders.
I got into ballet very young. I was 6 or 7, and so the arts world was very important to me. When I started school, my mom enrolled me in a local dance studio, and I fell in love with it, and that was my life.
So I remember when I was 7 years old, I chased a kid across the street, and I didn't bother to look both ways like my mom had taught me, and I got hit by a car. She hit me straight on, and I flew up in the air. I landed somehow safely on the ground, but I only came away with a broken femur and a scratch on my head. So I ended up being in the hospital for about 4 or 5 weeks in a full body cast. For all practical purposes, I should be dead. That was an experience where I felt like, my life was kind of unique, like God spared my life.
I started dancing professionally at 15. I was a trainee with the San Francisco Ballet. So I moved to San Francisco, and I lived there with a host family for a year. I went to school there, and that was my first kind of taste of this life, and I was definitely already hooked. It gave me a place to belong, and I think that's important especially when you're not raised in a faith household, right? And you're not good at sports, and you're not really that great at school. Like, where do you fit in, right? Who are your people? And that's something that the arts world and dance, ballet especially, gave me.
Through my teenage years, I didn't think about God much, and I definitely was not practicing Christianity. I wasn't going to church. I hadn't been to church in many years at that point. But there was kind of like this stirring in my heart. I was contemplating the spirit world, like, I knew there was angels, I knew there was spirits. I just had no, spiritual foundation seemingly for it. And the way I was raised in Christianity was very just like, two-dimensional, if you will. Not, just scriptures about life application.
So I was an early reader. I loved to read. And so I was always very fascinated with stories about fairies and magic. And so I was kind of already drawn to like the supernatural kind of side of things.
I believed in God. I believed in, a higher power out there, but I just hadn't really developed any relationship with Jesus. But my heart was seeking.
The arts world and all that you can think it could be, the bad things are true. And I, experienced a lot of that. I saw a lot of that. There's a lot of drugs. There's a lot of sexual abuse. There's a lot of just abuse overall. And, that shaped a lot of my perspective.
After I graduated from Hayes High School, just went right up the street to Southwest Texas State University, which is now Texas State University. Towards the end of my time there, I met a neighbor. He was teaching a martial arts class at the school, and he was always asking me to, hey, you should come take a class and just check it out, no pressure. And so the summer of '95, I did. He was into New Age, like shamanism type stuff, Buddhism type stuff, and the art itself was a Japanese art, Buddhist based, so much so that you would bow in before a Buddhist kamidana, which is that little shelf that has the house on it, and say a little chant or prayer, and it's a Buddhist chant in Japanese, and then when we bow out, we would do the same. So it had that spiritual undertone. What really attracted me to him and this martial art was the spiritual aspect of it. It wasn't really about fighting so much or kick somebody's butt or protect myself. It had nothing to do with any of that. It just had to do with feeling like there was something special there, something bigger than life itself there. I went all in. I trained 3 days a week and taught 2 days a week, and did that for almost 11 years. I was very drawn to the New Age arts, not necessarily magic, but more of like the spirit world. There's all types of sects of Buddhism, but this one was what they call an esoteric sect. It was very much into chants and, transcendental meditation, all the crazy stuff. The New Age type movement brings a lot of attention to the spirit world, but most people just don't really understand what they're getting themselves into. I definitely had like interactions with the spirit world, weird things happening. I saw things, and it made me kind of feel alive, I will say. It made me feel like connected to something greater than just what my five senses could see.
I moved to Austin in '97 to dance with Ballet Austin. My first year at Ballet Austin actually blew my knee out, and I was teaching as well because you can't make enough money just dancing professionally. And I remember calling my mom, and I couldn't dance anymore professionally. I couldn't do the hours and hours anymore. And I called my mom, and I was like, I don't really know what I'm gonna do. I didn't finish college. I didn't even graduate high school. I dropped out the end of my second semester my senior year. I just didn't care. And I remember thinking where am I going from here? I felt really lost at that point. My mom said, well, you should start your own school. You have so much experience. You've taught for years. You love teaching. And I did. It was true. And so I did. So I started a school in San Marcos. Summer is always tight for dance studios because you don't have a lot of income. And so I was extremely poor, and I had my power cut off. And I remember just being at a place where it was just a very dark place. I was still coming out of a world of a lot of sin, of a lot of just bad choices, and just things that I was very ashamed of in the arts world. And I remember it was like this low point in my life. I remember I was leaning against the counter, and I had my head down, and I was weeping. And I felt very alone. I had nobody. And my studio had only been there for about a year, I think, a year and a half at this point. And I remember thinking, is there even a God? Which was crazy, because I hadn't been actively really pursuing anything, but I remember thinking, God, if you are real, I need to know. I need to know something. I need to feel something, right? That was super important to me. And I remember just weeping, and I was saying these things out loud, and there was a part of me that was like, that's weird that I'm saying these things. Like, I remember having this whole like thought process. And okay, this is gonna sound crazy, but I'm just gonna put it out there. I felt the room. I just felt this presence in the room, and I had my head down, and I could see the room getting brighter, like someone was turning on a light, and I couldn't look up. And I remember just feeling this peace and this calmness and this certainty, knowing that God was real. And I didn't know that God was Jesus necessarily, right? But I knew without a doubt, probably for the first time in my life, that there were no questions as to whether God was real.
I owned a taxi cab company.
I was a poor business owner in San Marcos at this point, and I didn't have a car. I would walk sometimes to the studio, but it was too far to walk, and I worked like crazy hours. I would work 60, 70, 80 hours in it. I didn't want to walk home at night. So I realized that there was a local cab, and I called, and so I started getting rides on the taxi cab.
One of my drivers said, hey, you got to meet this girl driving our cab. Her name's Katherine. And I was like, okay, cool. So the day came, and she had called, wanted a ride, and I decided to take the ride and go pick her up, and we met, and it did not go well. She thought I was an idiot, which I was. She was very perceptive, and I thought she was rude.
He wore Hawaiian shirts, partially unbuttoned, and he was ridiculous. I have this memory that I tell everybody of when we first met. I got in the cab, and it was when Napster was big, which is that music sharing program. He's on the phone. I get in the car, and he's talking to his business partner, and he says, dude, listen to what I just downloaded. And he holds the phone up to his speaker, and it's this song called Get Your Freak On.
So that didn't go well.
I had gotten out of a relationship about 5 or 6 months before that, and so I was like, don't talk to me. I'm not interested. So he thought I was kind of beastly, which I was. And so for the first, 4 or 5 weeks, we barely spoke to each other. They closed at midnight, and so I would work to the bitter end till 11:45, and I'd have them pick me up. Well, we started to realize, I think, that we had things in common and that we weren't how we seemed. And so anyway, then we just started talking, and then we became friends. And then we had our first official date finally on Halloween that year. So, and then the rest is history. We've been inseparable ever since.
She was agnostic at that point, and we didn't really talk much about God, to be honest. The martial art was a very interesting dynamic because it was very tied to Buddhism. It was very tied to controlling your environment, controlling your surroundings, controlling people. My teacher was kind of like my best friend, but he was also somewhat overbearing or possessive of me. I submitted to him because I respected him. I saw him as a strong leader, and I trusted him, of course. He tried to control relationships I had. I had friends that he didn't like, and he would manipulate me to spend less time with them and eventually just cut them off. The triangle of Katherine and my martial arts teacher was very awkward, and so it was very stressful.
My years in San Marcos, those 11 years were really, really good. It was during that time that I was involved with a lot of people's families. Obviously, I was teaching their kids, and my desires started to change for my life. I started to truly desire a family of my own someday, and I really started to dig into faith type things and ask those questions. By this time I was in my late 20s, and so those things were starting to become a priority to me at that point.
My parents really loved Katherine just right off the bat, and at that point my parents were really seeking God.
It was about a year before we were married.
And my mom gave Katherine a Bible.
And I just started reading it, and I really felt God start speaking to me at that point. And then I started actively pursuing God. He was supportive of me. He was pretty much like, well, if this is working for you, that's great. Like, he was never ugly about it. He never even really made me feel bad about what I was believing or where I was at. It was almost like he was kind of rooting for me on my journey, even though he wasn't coming along with me. He was still very much involved in his martial art at that point. He was still kind of very much involved in the whole Buddhist side of things. He was not there. I just knew that I was going to pray for him. And so I did. So I started praying for him, and I started praying for us. And then I got on my knees and I told God, I know the Bible says I'm not supposed to be like yoked with a non-believer. I'm so conflicted. I don't know what to do, but I'm willing to call this whole thing off. I remember feeling that way. And the Lord just gave me so much peace. Like it was going to be okay.
Up to that point in my life, I didn't really feel like I had a purpose. And I thought the martial arts would fill that purpose, but it did not. And I think at this point I was a little jaded, a little unfulfilled. And I started really just contemplating God again. And I remember thinking, man, I joined this to become more connected spiritually. And here I was 9-10 years later. It did not fulfill what I thought it was going to fulfill.
At that point, I was going to different churches, trying to figure out where to land. I didn't have a church home. I was, reading scripture. I was talking to my in-laws. I was talking to other Christians. I was visiting churches, but I never felt settled anywhere. I knew I needed a church home. I needed to be discipled, but I just couldn't find it.
My wife and my martial arts instructor's wife became very close, and they started praying together, reading the Bible together. They even went to a couple of churches together by themselves without me and Jay, my teacher, and they started praying for us. My martial arts teacher had just started worshiping Jesus, and he was pushing away from the Buddhism thing, but he was kind of mixing them. So he was on his own journey, but he started talking to me about, God and Jesus Christ. I was like, wow, this is interesting. And I had so much respect for him at this point that I pretty much listened to whatever he said. Me and my teacher were going to Japan to train with the Grandmaster. It was a kind of a pilgrimage to go to train with the Grandmaster of the art. A lot of people in this art would do that if they could, and we did it. We made it happen. So while we were in Japan, we used to do guided meditation, but then one day he said, hey, let's pray. So we started praying. The Spirit of the Lord came on me while we were praying in a way I'd never experienced doing meditation, doing anything before. It was very powerful. I guess you could say it was kind of like a slain in the spirit type thing, but I was never unconscious or never passed out or anything goofy like that. I was very aware of God. And I felt like I was laying there under the power of God. God started talking to me, and he started talking to me about that moment when I was 7 years old. I got hit by the car. And the Lord showed me there that he spared my life, that he had an angel there to protect me, to catch me, if you will, and that he had a purpose for me. It was a greater purpose, and he kept me alive for a reason. That's when I realized his hand had been on me my whole life. I hadn't really had that thought up to that point. So when I heard that from God, it just it changed everything.
He called me before he came home, and he told me that something had happened, but that he wanted to talk to me in person. And I was like, oh, okay, great. And so he came home, and the night he came home, he told me about this experience he had had with God. We went over to his parents' house, and he apologized to his parents for, things he'd done in the past and just wanting to make that relationship right. And then friends of his that he had falling out with, he called. It was a true conversion experience. And of course, that just increased my faith. I was just like, wow, this is amazing. And then we started actively seeking a church together. And I think that's probably looking back in our lives, we have a lot of great memories, a lot of great things, but that is probably one of my favorite time of our lives because we were both on fire for God. We were both in the same place. We were both seeking God together. We were expecting our first child. It was almost magical, like looking back. It's all the things you hear about new believers and new Christians, and I still have such vivid memories of it, and it's probably one of my most cherished memories that I have. It was such an incredible time.
Man, I want to be with other people of faith. I want to hear their stories. I want to pray with them. I want them to pray with me. We were so excited about living for God, being part of a church, and there's just a feeling of wonder and excitement living for God. We really never looked back from that point. We went all in.
It was so interesting to hear how God pursued Jason and Katherine in such personal and unique ways. How strange that in Jason's story, it was his Buddhist martial arts instructor who was most influential in leading him to Jesus. Proof that God sometimes uses unexpected methods to draw people to himself. Katherine's story of encountering Jesus, seeing her dark apartment fill with light, even though the power was off, was fascinating. God showed Katherine that he was real in a way that deeply impacted her. These stories are a reminder to me that God is not a cookie-cutter God who does cookie-cutter things. He is tailor-making each of our stories and breaking into our lives in extremely personal ways that speak to the heart of each of our personalities and wiring. That truly is incredible. In this episode, you got a taste for Katherine's feisty spirit, always asking questions and pushing back. And you started to understand Jason's all-in, super loyal personality as well. Getting to know Jason and Katherine's personalities in this episode will help make sense of what's about to happen in the story. But get ready, the next part gets a little wonky.
Jason is the most loyal, wonderful person you'll ever meet. But when he's all in something, he's all in. Like, there's no gray area, right? It's either hot or cold, black or white, you're in, you're out, right? And so he was all in. And so that was very difficult because I couldn't talk to him about it.
Be sure to tune in 1 week from now when we share the rest of Jason and Katherine's story in part 2 of When Church Hurts.
Hi, my name is Shelley and I'm from Austin, Texas. I love the Story Partners podcast because as I listen to each individual story, I see what a loving and intentional Heavenly Father we have. He cares so deeply for his children and is in every detail. Story Partners is a nonprofit ministry that tells stories that point people to Jesus. We tell these stories through short documentary films as well as this podcast. We are a crowd-funded ministry funded by monthly giving from people like me. To learn more or to join our crowdfunding community, visit us at storypartners.org.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Story Partners podcast. This story was recorded and edited by Walt and Annie Manus. If you were encouraged by it, we hope you'll share it with a friend. We'll see you next time.